Well, democracy is clearly, not only a crucial idea to you, but also to Project Liberal as a whole.
Yeah.
There are people, many of them within the libertarian movement, who see democracy as something of a wolf in sheep's clothing. The anarcho-capitalist Hermann Hoppe, for example, has written very extensively against democratic forms of government, most notably in his book, Democracy, the God That Failed.
Mm-hmm.
And among his claims, he's said that, a democracy, for example, would have a higher time preference than a monarchy. As a counterexample, democratic leaders don't own the government, so they have less incentive to think about the long term than a king, who would be responsible for his government for a much longer amount of time. And as for some people who might argue that, well, can't a lousy government just be voted out? He has also stated that it is in that democratic government's interests to buy votes, essentially, by appealing to the poor with welfare benefits, for example, that could be paid for by the rich. And if democracy does depend on the majority and these poor people can be bought off with welfare, democratic politicians then would naturally be incentivized to keep the number of poor people as high as possible. And that's Hoppe's case. One observation I would like to make, and one that I'm a bit curious about, and I'm wondering if you can, address this for me.
Yeah.
If treating democracy as an intrinsic aspect of liberty does seem to be, it almost seems to cheapen the meaning of liberty in a way. After all, because I see liberty as an objective state of affairs, and under democracy, liberty almost seems to be redefined as what the most people vote for. If the majority of people were, for example, to vote for a certain subgroup within society to be very brutally and overwhelmingly taxed, we could potentially claim from there that it could still be passed off as a free and just society, simply because it had been arrived at democratically, and that the people had been given a voice in making this decision. So with this kind of laid out, how do you essentially respond to the Hoppian critique of democracy?
That's a great question. So first, actually, I'll talk about the 2 points you brought up, and then let's talk a bit about just that meaning of liberty thing. Because I actually think there's something to that. I was talking to somebody about this the other day. It is an interesting intellectual exercise, I guess, but I cannot think about a monarch somehow. Monarchs aren't thinking about the future. They're thinking about themselves, right? Monarchs are thinking about how they can enrich themselves and benefit themselves. When you give centralized power and authority to individuals, we understand this is the way humans operate. They're selfish. They seek to benefit themselves. I think that concept that somehow a monarch is going to think about the future and not think about how he can use the levers and tools of ultimate power over a society to benefit himself on the backs of the people that he's controlling is like not only incredibly naive, but I couldn't even think about an analogy throughout history. Maybe you could point to a handful of like good Roman emperors or something that like did great for a couple of years. But almost every single story about monarchy is not a story about, the great enrichment of these societies and these wonderful free people that go out. It's a story of tyranny. It's a story of one individual having ultimate control, ultimate ownership. It's the antithesis of a free society. It does not fit into a framework like that. The other thing I'll say, this idea that monarchy or democracy is incentivizes the people, keeping people poor so that they're relying on welfare, is lunacy. Look at history. The advent of liberal democracy created the most freedom and prosperity for the poor and middle class that we have seen in human history. Liberal democracy, which came out of the Enlightenment, brought more people out of poverty and into economic personal prosperity, freedom, than any other system devised by man, period. That was not done. I mean, monarchs had thousands of years to figure that problem out. They did not. The decentralization of political power out of the hands of a few and the expansion of political freedom into the hands of many has been objectively one of the greatest political innovations of the modern time. I will say, though, to your point, there is this problem, and we've talked about this internally, around framing democracy as a good in and of itself. And I actually think and maybe I'm misreading your point, so tell me if I'm off base, but I think that you're actually correct in a way. The pursuit of democracy is not necessarily a good thing in and of itself. The reason that's the case is because like we know democracy is a flawed system, just like monarchy or any of the others. They are flawed systems, but democracy is the least flawed of all the systems. It's like the alternative to democracy is effectively monarchy or tyranny or these other strongman dictatorial systems. So when I talk about it, we've actually spoken about this a lot. It's not that we're pursuing democracy, it's that we're pursuing political and individual freedom. We're pursuing a system where people have the control or the ability to insert themselves and have control over the way their government runs and how it to control the scope of its involvement in their lives, right? And have a voice there. So really, liberalism is a pursuit of political freedom, and democracy is just simply like the system that comes out of that. And I don't think that a framework that says we must abolish the levers, the mechanism for people to have political freedom and political attitude in their lives will in any way lead to more prosperity, more freedom, and a better society. I, in fact, think we've already seen that story. And that story was thousands of years of poverty, of destitution, of abuse, of tyranny. And thanks to liberal democracy and the Enlightenment and the limitations put on power, the move from it being run by a man and relying on the consent of the governed, was an incredible achievement for humanity. And I don't think we should abandon that by any means. That's one of the reasons why I use full-throated embrace of liberal democracies, because I think it was a very powerful tool to improve people's lives, you know.
To your point, you know, roughly I know what Hoppe and many of his peers will say in regards to, let's say, the benefits that have been brought with, you know, simultaneously with these establishment of these liberal democracies. They might claim that this is, in their view, a post hoc fallacy. They might claim that, you know, around this time that this was established, there had been great maybe industrial advancements, steps forward in that regard. And they might argue that in the sense, you know, the improvement of the standard of living was happening despite these democracies rather than because of them. They might also claim that, you know, even if these kings are acting in their self-interest, the king's desire to act in his self-interest would, as a secondary consequence, also benefit the life of the people in his nation. But this is basically the rough outline of Hoppe's case.
Well, I mean, I would say that the advent of political freedom and economic freedom and individual freedom, the ideas that came out of the Enlightenment, you can't separate those things. So, like, this is the same thing I talk to the social democrats about. It's this idea. This is the problem, I think, with illiberal philosophies, is they say, okay, freedom's a good thing, but only in this, like, okay, this is what social democrats will do. They say freedom's a good thing, but only when it comes to social issues. Like, people should be free to do what they want with their own bodies and move and all these things and choose who they marry. That's great, but not economic freedom. And on the right nowadays, I'm seeing it like, you know, economic freedom is good, although with some exceptions. We just talked about how they're rejecting economic openness and all that. But let's just say Reagan era, right? Economic freedom is good, but maybe, you know, political freedom should be tampered a little bit. Maybe certain groups should have more rights than other groups or more power over society, or maybe you shouldn't be able to choose what you have in your body, and we're not going to. I don't, that philosophy, that just does not work. Freedom is a good concept. Expanding freedom, more political, economic, and personal freedom to more people is what creates prosperity, period. So this idea that you're going to separate those things is basically, it's basically like woke. It's like woke libertarianism. It just makes no sense to me. It's the same arguments I hear from the Bernie bros. Like, well, you know, like social liberalism is good, but economic liberalism is bad. It's like, well, you know, Hoppians almost say, in a way, they actually say all of them are bad, actually. We don't really think about it. But, and so I would say that, and political freedom, I don't think you could separate those things. I mean, the enfranchisement of more people has led to more prosperity. Those things happen all at the same time because it was a governing, overarching philosophy of individual freedom that applies to all those different axes. Those things are the magic secret sauce, you know, that created more prosperity. There's a reason why the United States is the most prosperous country in the world, and it's because we've tried to realize that vision and apply it to every element of society. We haven't done perfect, but it's not like, you know, the enfranchisement of more people have led to a more we are still the most prosperous country in the world. Like, as we've expanded suffrage and enfranchisement to more people, we've continued to grow and succeed and be more prosperous.